So I'm here with Dr. Nigel Aston, who's been speaking at the Georgian Delights exhibition, all about the return of the Royal Mistress. So do you want to just outline, in summary if you like, what it is that you've been arguing about, the importance of the Mistress in the age of George IV?
Try to emphasise that the return of a Royal Mistress is quite a novelty in the life of the British Crown and States in the early 19th century. There hadn't been an official Royal Mistress since Amalie van Volmaden had returned to Hanover in 1760 on the death of King George IV's great-grandfather, George II, in 1760. So the British public are having to get used to the fact there is not only a queen, and a very controversial queen in the shape of Caroline of Brunswick, but also a very interesting middle-aged royal mistress in the shape and person of Marchioness Coningham, who in 1820 had just displaced George's previous mistress, Lady Hertford. And the influence of those women in public life, as well as the private life of the king in that decade, is too easily overlooked. Without wanting to claim too much for the influence of both women, one should restate the influence that there is rather more emphatically than has been done recently.
And in terms of the two women that you concentrated on, so Lady Hertford and Lady Coningham, they were quite political, weren't they? I mean, they got political views. So how did they play out?
Very much so. Lady Hertford belonged to a Tory family. The key political question of the 1810s and 1820s is more Catholic emancipation than parliamentary reform. And Lady Hertford was a committed Protestant in the sense that she wanted to retain the existing religious tests in the state by which conformity to the Church of England was a prerequisite for service in the state. She was also the political ally of the Tories, and when George became regent in 1811, her influence was considerable in persuading the king, who needed some persuasion, not to sack the Tory ministry under Spencer Perceval and replace it with a Whig one led by Lords Grey and Grenville, but instead to continue with his father's ministers. It was the great political question of 1811 to 1812. So Lady Hertford is very much a Protestant. Lady Coningham is more pragmatic. She's Canningite in her sympathies, perhaps, for much of the 1820s, but also inclined towards a sort of moderate Whig views, and certainly has friends in the Whig party. And her influence in persuading a very reluctant monarch in 1829 to accept that Catholic emancipation is unavoidable needs, I think, to be recognised more clearly than it has been doing. If there is no constitutional crash in 1829, it is because Lady Coningham offsets the very much pro-Protestant view of the king's brother, the Duke of Cumberland, and in their private apartments at Windsor Castle persuades the man she called Kingy to agree to Wellington's request to go forward with Catholic emancipation.
I think what's interesting is, sometimes historians talk about big abstractions and big themes, but actually, it seems to me what you're arguing reminds us of the importance of the personality and the individual in politics. You can certainly expand on that, but I'm also interested in what you think about George's emotional needs. So what is it that these women are supplying in his life that he's not getting elsewhere?
Both these women are providing him with company, attractive female company, attractive middle-aged female company. They're fussing over him. they're giving the king the attention that arguably he never had as a youngster. And they're also providing him with an entree to a family life, a domestic life, which he's never had before. It's so easy to forget that George IV actually likes children. He's not a sort of, an endless party giver at Carlton House and in the Brighton Pavilion. He likes nothing better than a quiet evening in, perhaps with a glass of port rather than a mug of cocoa. But nevertheless, he likes to sit around with the family of his mistress, and even with her husband. He's quite content. This is more a kind of affectionate friendship than a red-hot sexual relationship. And it's very significant that both Ladies Hertford and Cunningham are the king's age approximately, one slightly older, one slightly younger. But George isn't looking for the attention of a much younger woman. It doesn't seem to appeal to him at all. Not in the slightest. So it's company, intelligent company. Both women are fairly shrewd in their own way. They're trading the domesticity and company that they offer in return for the benefits that the king can provide in terms of patronage for their husbands, sons and daughters. It's a two-way relationship. It's not jobbery, it's just the normal relationship between a king and his mistress. But it's for the men and women in England in the 1820s, this is something which had been forgotten for 2 or 3 generations. It's much back to an older model of monarchy.
And you illustrate your talk with some fantastic caricatures, which is one of the great advantages we have as historians of that time.
Sure.
So we don't have the personal correspondence,
We don't.
but we do have this scurrilous sort of satirical output.
Yes.
So how significant was the sort of public reputation of the mistresses, given quite how much they were attacked?
There's a lot of public interest in the imagined lives of Ladies Hertford and Cunningham. The fact that they are neither of them spring chickens in terms of age enables the caricaturist Cruikshank, Gilray et al. To, if you like, have scope for distortion in a way which played into the hands of those who had a political stake in deploring the imagined influences of both mistresses. They had to put up with a lot of personal criticism in return for the advantages or not of the familiarity with King George. And both handle it quite well, I would say. They have all these brickbats to deal with. How far is public opinion adverse to them? It's difficult to say. I think the majority of the British public probably accepted it. That minority of urban opinion, which regarded Lady Hertford in particular as an obstacle to reform, tended to have it in for her by 1818, 1819. But one should perhaps see that as a symbol of that wider sort of public interest in removing barriers to reform and using Lady Hertford as a kind of lightning conductor for the regent's personal opposition to parliamentary and Catholic reform at that date.
And do you think that politicians, and particularly given your interest in the church, do you think churchgoers or the church authorities sort of learned to tolerate the fact that their king was defender of faith, but also, cavorting with married ladies and keeping mistresses? I mean,
Yes.
did they see
It's a
any
good question.
contradiction in that?
It's a good question. I think the church found handling the king rather difficult, not least because the key question for the hierarchy of the Church of England was how committed would George IV be to retaining Anglican privileges and an Anglican establishment against the claims of dissenters and Roman Catholics. That was the overriding public concern for the hierarchy. And the king's private life was perhaps something that churchmen preferred not to comment on. George showed a tendency towards, if you like, returning to the church, particularly in the second half of his reign. And to claim that George IV was, by definition, sceptical of Christianity is far from the truth. He had a very good Anglican deathbed in many respects, taking Holy Communion shortly before he died. Through Lady Cunningham, he acted as the patron of Charles Sumner, a future senior Bishop of Winchester in the church. George had always had a minority of supporters in the Church of England, and there is very little public criticism of the king's personal lifestyle. I think clergy had other things to do. If George had a penchant for wanting to prefer clerics whose merits perhaps really didn't allow it into the higher reaches of the church, then that's where Lord Liverpool's government could step in to put a brake on those appointments, perhaps reach a compromise. And it shouldn't be forgotten just how keen Lord Liverpool was to ensure that talented men were really preferred to senior posts in the Church of England, rather than those who expected that birth or wealth would get them the plum jobs in the church.
And just by way of a summary, I guess, in terms of the reign of George IV, the 1820s, you were asked in the questions at the end of your lectures how we should think about that period. So, I mean, what's your take on it? I sense that you're wanting us to rethink a little bit about our popular conception of that period in British history.
I think the 200th anniversary of the accession of George IV provides historians with a wonderful opportunity to rebuild our understanding of that decade. It's too often seen as a prelude to parliamentary reform and the Whig reforms of the 1830s, rather than as a period in its own right. I think we need to move away from some teleological view of the 1820s as a kind of regressive decade as opposed to the progressive decade which will follow it, and instead to see it as one in which actually government is pretty efficient, one in which Catholic emancipation remains an issue which continues to pop up, but not until relatively late in the decade becomes the overriding issue of public concern. It's also one in which parliamentary reform is seen as a measure which is adopted and supported by the Whigs for political as much as constitutional reasons. We have to understand the 1820s perhaps in terms of what comes before rather than what comes later. And if anything, one might argue that the whole decade until Catholic emancipation is granted shows the vitality of the Revolution Constitution, and that it's still working more than a century after 1688. And that perhaps we need to return to Jonathan Clarke's view of the 1980s, that actually 1820, the measures of 1829 and 1832 are really more politically motivated and constitutionally avoidable, or at least needn't have taken the shape that they did. And one needs to remember too that in advocating both Catholic reform and parliamentary reform, the Whigs are playing a game which they hope will benefit themselves rather than the Tories, and provide at last the lever that they're looking for to return them to government for the first time since 1806.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a fascinating way in, or a route into, the exhibition and some of its major themes. So thanks very much for coming to Nottingham and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.
Thank you.